Imagine you've spent decades sitting on the most valuable resource on the planet. You built a civilization on it. A trillion-dollar safety net, free universities, universal health care, a standard of living most countries can only dream about. And then, just as the world decides it no longer wants what you're selling, the ground beneath your feet reveals an entirely different kind of treasure. Not oil, something rarer, something the modern world might need even more desperately. But deep in the ancient bedrock of Norway's Rogaland region, geologists have confirmed one of the most significant mineral discoveries of the 21st century: 70 billion tons of phosphate rock. A deposit so massive it could supply the entire world's demand for decades. And the timing couldn't be more extraordinary. To understand why this discovery matters, you have to understand the Norway that built itself on black gold. In 1969, a single offshore oil field changed the course of a nation. The Ekofisk discovery in the North Sea didn't just produce petroleum, it produced a philosophy. Norway decided, almost uniquely among resource-rich nations, to save rather than spend. The result is the Government Pension Fund Global. $1.7 trillion in assets, the largest sovereign wealth fund on Earth. A financial cushion so enormous it earns more in a single day than most countries collect in tax revenue in an entire year. But Norway has always known the clock was ticking. Over the past decade, Oslo has quietly repositioned itself for a world beyond fossil fuels. Electric vehicles now account for more than 80% of new car sales in the country. Offshore wind capacity is expanding along its western coast. Hydrogen infrastructure is being threaded into the fjords. The Norwegians are not panicking about the end of the oil era. They are planning for it. And in a country this methodical, this disciplined, a phosphate deposit of this scale isn't just a geological footnote. It's a strategic asset of the first order. Most people have never heard of phosphate, and that is quietly one of the most dangerous gaps in public understanding today. Because phosphate is holding the modern world together almost invisibly. It is the backbone of global agriculture. Without phosphorus, plants cannot grow, and without synthetic fertilizers, derived from phosphate rock, modern farming cannot feed 8 billion people. It's that simple. Remove phosphate from the equation, and crop yields collapse within a generation. The agricultural world consumes roughly 50 million tons of phosphate rock every single year. And unlike oil, you cannot synthesize it. You cannot manufacture it in a laboratory. You can only mine it from the places where ancient geology happened to concentrate it over hundreds of millions of years. And right now, because that geography is dangerously narrow, Morocco alone controls an estimated 70% of the world's known phosphate reserves. China controls much of the downstream processing. Together, they represent a supply chain choke point that every food-producing nation on Earth quietly depends on and quietly worries about. But phosphate's second story is even more urgent than the first. The green energy revolution runs on batteries. And the fastest growing battery chemistry in the world right now is LFP, lithium iron phosphate. Used in electric vehicles, grid-scale energy storage, and consumer electronics, LFP batteries are cheaper, safer, and more thermally stable than competing chemistries. They are also the battery of choice for mass-market electric vehicles coming out of China and increasingly everywhere else. And they require enormous quantities of phosphate to produce. As the world races to electrify transportation, power grids, and heating systems, demand for phosphate is set to surge simultaneously on two completely separate fronts: agriculture and energy. Norway just found itself sitting on both answers at once. Here is the part that keeps policymakers awake at night. The green energy transition was supposed to free the Western world from dependence on politically volatile suppliers. But in pivoting away from oil, Europe has found itself building an entirely new set of dependencies on lithium from South America, cobalt from Central Africa, rare earth elements from China, and phosphate from Morocco. The geography has changed. The vulnerability has not. For Europe in particular, supply chain security has moved from an abstract policy debate to something far more urgent. The disruptions of recent years, whether from pandemics, conflict, or shifting trade alliances, expose just how brittle interconnected global supply chains can become when stress is applied. A domestic European source of phosphate doesn't just improve a trade balance sheet. It changes the negotiating posture of an entire continent. Norway's Rogaland deposit, if developed responsibly, could anchor a domestic fertilizer industry, feed European battery manufacturing, and reduce the continent's exposure to suppliers who may not always share its interests. When Norway, of course, is very good at extracting things from the earth at scale. The institutional expertise, the engineering capabilities, the regulatory frameworks forged in the North Sea oil industry, all of it transfers. A nation that mastered offshore drilling in some of the most hostile waters on Earth is reasonably well positioned to master large-scale phosphate extraction. The question is not whether Norway can do this. The question is whether it should, and at what cost. No honest conversation about phosphate mining is complete without confronting what it leaves behind. Phosphate ore is not clean. When you extract it and process it into usable form, you generate enormous quantities of a byproduct called phosphogypsum, a waste material produced in roughly a 5-to-1 ratio with the phosphate itself. For every single ton of usable phosphate concentrate, 5 tons of phosphogypsum. That waste carries radium, uranium, and thorium. Naturally occurring radioactive materials that exist in trace concentrations within phosphate rock and accumulate during the refining process. Managing this material safely requires permanent, engineered containment. Failures. And there have been serious failures in other parts of the world can contaminate groundwater and coastal ecosystems for generations. Norway's Rogaland region is home to some of the country's most ecologically sensitive landscapes. Salmon rivers, ancient coastal inlets, ecosystems that feed into the broader North Sea. A terrestrial mining operation of this magnitude would permanently reshape the physical landscape of an inhabited living region. This is not a reason to walk away from the opportunity, but it is an absolute reason to move slowly, carefully, and with full transparency about the trade-offs involved. The Norwegians have one significant advantage that most phosphate mining nations have historically lacked: money. The Sovereign Wealth Fund exists precisely to absorb the long-term costs of getting complex, generational decisions right. Norway can afford to over-engineer its environmental safeguards. It can afford to spend a decade planning before it extracts a single ton. Whether it chooses to exercise that patience is a different and far more important question. The phosphate discovery in Rogaland is not yet a mine. It is a possibility, an enormous, the consequential possibility that Norway must now decide what to do with. The most optimistic version of this story looks something like this. Norway leverages its geological wealth, its institutional discipline, and its industrial expertise to build something that has rarely existed in the history of resource extraction: a genuinely responsible supply chain. It supplies European farmers with domestically sourced fertilizer. It feeds battery manufacturers across the continent. It positions itself not simply as the country that got rich from oil, but as the country that helped the world transition away from it. In that version, The phosphate discovery is not just an economic windfall. It is a second act, a chance to write a different kind of resource story for the 21st century. The more cautionary version looks different. The pressure of global demand moves faster than Norway's regulatory caution can keep pace with. Environmental protections are negotiated away under the weight of short-term economic opportunity. The waste accumulates. The rivers absorb the consequences. And in a generation, Norway finds itself managing a new and far less flattering resource legacy. Not the golden one built on oil, but the complicated one of extraction done too fast, too cheaply, with too little thought for what comes after. The difference between those two futures is not geology, it is governance. It is the quality of the decisions made in the next 10 years by the people charged with stewarding this discovery. Norway has always been a small country that punches above its weight in quality of life, in environmental ambition, in the sophistication of its institutions. It got lucky once with oil. It may have gotten lucky again with phosphate. The real question, the one only the Norwegians can answer, is whether this second stroke of luck becomes a lasting legacy, or simply a familiar story wearing different clothes. Somewhere beneath the mountains of Rogaland, that answer is still being written.